They called me useless at my sister-in-law's wedding, thinking I'd shrink away like I always had. But this time, I had a different plan, one that would make them regret every word. I turned their insults into the most powerful revenge they could never have seen coming, and when the truth hit them, they were left speechless. My name is Emma, and I've always considered myself the quiet one in the family. I'm not the kind to take center stage, to chase the spotlight, or even to have a big social presence. I prefer the peace of my own company, a few close friends, and my work. But somehow, no matter how much I tried to maintain my peace, my family found a way to intrude. It had been a while since I'd been to one of my sister-in-law Natalie's family events. She was always the life of the party, always pulling in attention like a magnet. And I had long since learned that if I wasn't careful, I'd be lost in her shine. You see, Natalie had this way of making everyone feel like they were either in or out, like there were those who mattered and those who didn't. The important people were always around her, basking in her charm while the rest of us, well, we were left to the sidelines, often invisible. So when I got the wedding invitation for Natalie's big day, I should have known it was going to be a spectacle. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a subtle announcement that this wedding was going to be her crowning moment. And for me, it was one more opportunity to slip into the background, to witness the spectacle from a distance, and to once again feel the sting of being the quiet one. I didn't particularly want to go, not because I had anything against her marriage. Hell, I didn't even know the guy she was marrying, but because I knew how these things went. Family weddings weren't the places where peace was found. Instead, they were arenas where judgment was passed in the form of compliments that were anything but. Where the "do you have a boyfriend yet?" and "why aren't you married?" Questions came at you like clockwork. The questions weren't asked out of care, they were wielded like weapons. Weapons designed to poke, to prod, to make me feel less than. But of course, when the invitation arrived, I couldn't ignore it. My mom had already mentioned it in passing, subtly pressuring me to attend. She'd used her usual line: "You know, Emma, the family's going to be there. It won't be the same without you." As if my absence would cause a noticeable gap, as if they truly cared. But I knew better than that. I wasn't a missed presence in that family, I was an afterthought, a side character in the drama that always unfolded around Natalie. Still, I agreed. My mom's voice, full of that unspoken guilt, had done its job, and so I made the decision to go. It wasn't about Natalie or her new life. It wasn't even about trying to avoid the awkward questions or the fake smiles from my relatives. It was about maintaining that sense of duty to my family. To my mom, to be specific, she had always believed that if you showed up to the family events, if you participated, everything would be fine. I could never quite shake the feeling that this idea of participation wasn't so much for me as it was for her to feel better about the whole mess. I told myself that I would keep a low profile, find a corner somewhere, and just get through the day. But little did I know, my time at this wedding would be more than just an uncomfortable family gathering. It would be a turning point, a moment that would make me realize how much I had been overlooked and underestimated, how much they thought I didn't matter. The moment I walked into that venue, I knew something was off. The air was thick with expectation, with tension. Everything about it screamed, "Look at me." The decor was magnificent, yes, but it was also a reminder that this wedding wasn't just about love, it was about status. The more I looked around, the more I felt out of place. The guests were dressed to the nines, laughing, talking, posing. Meanwhile, I was just another face in the crowd, another woman who had no place to call her own in this spectacle. It was the perfect reflection of how I'd always felt in this family, like I didn't fit. I could already hear the whispers behind my back, those subtle glances that tried to figure out who I was, why I was there, and why I hadn't yet conformed to their idea of success. They had it all mapped out for me, of course. You need a husband, you need kids, you need a family, you need to stop working so much and start living. But none of that appealed to me. I had built a life for myself that was independent, fulfilling, and quiet, exactly how I wanted it. And yet, there I was, surrounded by people who had it all figured out, or so they thought, watching me like I was a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. As I walked toward my assigned seat, I could already feel the weight of their judgment. The small talk at the tables was filled with comments about people's successful lives, their kids, their homes, their vacations. And there I was, an outsider in a room full of insiders. It didn't matter that I had a thriving career. It didn't matter that I had my own place, my own hobbies, my own set of accomplishments. All that mattered was that I wasn't like them. I wasn't part of their mold, and in their eyes, that made me, well, useless. That was when it happened. As I sat at my table trying to sink into the background, my SIL Natalie strolled past. She flashed me a bright smile, one of those smiles that was a little too wide, a little too rehearsed. Her eyes flicked over me as if I were invisible, and then the words came. Emma, you're looking, well, nice, I guess. Though I've always wondered, what do you do with your time? Not married, no kids, what's your purpose, really? She said it as if she were asking a simple question, but in reality, it was a barb, a thinly veiled jab designed to remind me of my status in the family pecking order. The room went quiet for a split second as if they were all waiting for me to respond. I felt their eyes on me, some sympathetic, some mocking. But I didn't flinch, instead, I smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes, but it was enough. I'm just busy, living life. I wouldn't expect you to understand. I knew that response would hang in the air, unanswered, because the truth was, I didn't need their validation. I had my own, and it was time to show them exactly what they had underestimated. But not today. Not yet. Today, I was going to let them keep believing they had the upper hand, because when it came time for the last laugh, they wouldn't even see it coming, and I couldn't wait. The night carried on like any other family event. Awkward silences and forced conversations mixed in with overly loud laughs and comments designed to keep everyone on their toes. There was a rhythm to these family events, a predictable pattern of who would dominate the conversation, who would be dismissed, and who would be left in the background. I had long accepted my role as the background player. I didn't fight it anymore. It was easier that way. Easier to let them think I was content with being overlooked. The wedding itself was beautiful, of course. Natalie, dressed in white and glowing, radiated the kind of attention she always craved. She had that air about her, like everything she did was deserving of applause, and like everyone else was merely there to celebrate her. The ceremony, the vows, the speeches, they all felt like parts of a performance where she was the leading lady and everyone else was an extra. And there I was, sitting at a table at the far end of the room, trying to keep to myself. I was doing just fine, managing not to get sucked into the ridiculous drama that seemed to follow my family around. That was until I overheard a conversation between Natalie and her best friend, Melissa. They were sitting not far from me, and the talk was just loud enough for me to catch a few choice words. I just don't get it, Melissa said with a laugh, her voice dripping with judgment. How is Emma still so, I don't know, not doing anything with her life? I mean, she's smart, right? But what is she doing with that? At least I've got a family, you've got a husband, kids. What does she have? A job she spends too much time at. I froze, every part of me stiffening at the subtle jab. They were talking about me, about my choice not to follow their blueprint for success. Their words were thinly veiled, but I could feel the sting of each sentence. To them, I wasn't just Emma. I was the failure, the one who didn't fit in, the one who didn't conform to the standard of success they had all agreed upon. But it wasn't just the judgment that hit me. It was the casualness with which they spoke about me. The way they dismissed everything I'd accomplished. They didn't know it, but it hit harder than anything they had ever said to my face. The quiet sneer behind their words told me exactly what they thought of me. I could have walked over there and confronted them. I could have blasted them for their arrogance, for being so blind to my life and the hard work I'd put in. I could have done that. But in that moment, something inside me told me to wait, to hold my tongue, because this wasn't a battle I was going to win by shouting. No, the best revenge wasn't going to be in a confrontation. It would be in something much bigger. Instead of showing my anger, I stood up and walked across the room. I didn't make a big scene or look their way, but deep down, I knew that whatever they said, whatever they believed, was no longer going to control how I saw myself. I had made it this far without their validation, and I was going to finish this wedding day without their opinions shaking me. The evening continued with the usual rounds of polite mingling, but something was changing inside me. That little spark of anger, the frustration that had always bubbled beneath the surface, was finally starting to ignite. They thought they knew me. They thought they had me figured out, that they could box me in with their judgments, their labels, but they didn't. I had my own plans. Plans they couldn't see, plans they would never understand. As the night went on, I found myself sitting in the back, quietly sipping my drink, my mind racing with all the ways I could show them they had no idea who I really was. And I knew that the best way to make them regret their words wasn't by lashing out, it was by showing them exactly what I'd been working on in silence. After all, they weren't just attacking my life, they were attacking everything I had worked so hard to build. And they were about to find out that the person they dismissed so easily was about to rise higher than they could ever imagine. I could feel it then, the shift. The energy in me started to change. The frustration started turning into something else, something more focused, more determined. They had made the mistake of thinking they could belittle me, thinking they could call me useless and get away with it. But I wasn't going to let it slide this time. No, this time I was going to show them. The wedding night ended with the usual farewells, but I couldn't help but feel a fire burning inside me. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that room. I wasn't the same person who had sat quietly and accepted their judgments without a second thought. And from that moment on, I knew that nothing would be the same. Natalie and her friends didn't know it yet, but their words had lit a spark. And now I had a plan, one that would leave them speechless, stunned, and regretting every word they had spoken. I wasn't going to be the quiet one anymore. I wasn't going to be the useless sister-in-law. I was going to make sure they understood exactly who I was and how wrong they had been. The days following the wedding were quiet. Too quiet. It felt like everything had returned to normal, but I could still hear their words echoing in my mind. I could still see their smug faces, pretending to be so above me, while dismissing everything I'd worked for with a simple, cutting remark. But I wasn't going to let it go, not this time. I didn't immediately react because I knew better. I knew that if I played my cards too quickly, I'd just be giving them the satisfaction of knowing they had rattled me. No, this time I was going to keep my cool and bide my time. There would be a time for my response, and it would come when they least expected it. And when it came, it was going to be explosive. The days after the wedding were filled with my usual routine: work, the gym, evenings with my few close friends. But even as I moved through the motions, my mind was constantly running through the possibilities. How could I make them regret calling me useless? How could I show them that I was so much more than they ever gave me credit for? I had the answer one evening when I was sitting at my desk scrolling through some emails. One of them caught my attention, an opportunity I had been working on in the background for the last few months. It was a project I had kept quiet about, something I had intentionally kept under wraps, not wanting to bring attention to it until it was ready. But now, with everything that had happened, I knew this was the perfect moment to pull the trigger. It was a business deal I had been negotiating with a major tech company. They had shown interest in my startup, a company I had built from the ground up on my own. And now, after months of meetings, calls, and proposals, the deal was about to be finalized. A deal worth millions. As I stared at the email confirming the final terms of the contract, something inside me clicked. This was it. This was my moment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about showing them who I had become. It was about finally taking my place in the world, no longer hidden in the shadows of their expectations. I wasn't going to wait for them to notice. I was going to make them see it for themselves. I immediately made plans to attend an upcoming industry conference, one where top business leaders from around the country would be gathering. It wasn't the kind of event where my family would ever expect to see me, especially not after they had written me off as useless. But I wasn't going to just attend. I was going to speak at it. I was going to announce my deal, my success, in front of an audience full of influential people. And I was going to make sure my family heard about it. I spent the next few days preparing. I worked on my presentation, rehearsed my speech, and made sure everything was lined up perfectly. It was going to be a calculated move, something that would leave them in no doubt about what I had achieved. And I wasn't going to make it subtle. I wasn't going to hold back. They had called me useless. Now it was time to show them what that word really meant. The day of the conference arrived, and I felt a mix of excitement and determination. As I walked into the venue, I couldn't help but smile to myself. This was the moment. I was going to take control. I was going to stand on that stage in front of hundreds of people and make my mark. No more being overlooked, no more being underestimated. I was going to command the room. I stood backstage, waiting for my turn to speak, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. When the announcer called my name, I walked out onto the stage, the lights blinding me for a moment before I adjusted to the sea of faces in the crowd. And then I began. I started with my story, the journey that had led me to this point. The struggles, the late nights, the risks I had taken. I spoke about my business, about how I had built it from nothing, and how, in spite of everything, I had managed to secure a multi-million-dollar deal. I could feel the room hanging on my every word. I wasn't just talking about business, I was talking about resilience. I was talking about proving everyone who doubted me wrong. As I wrapped up my presentation, I made a point to thank everyone who had supported me along the way, but then I added a line that I knew would cut through the crowd like a hot knife through butter. I'd also like to thank my family for always believing in me, even when they didn't understand me. I said with a smile, my eyes scanning the crowd as I felt the weight of the words sink in. I could practically hear the gasp that went through the room. This wasn't just a business announcement. This was me taking back my narrative. This was me reclaiming my place in the world. I could almost hear Natalie's voice in my head, her words about my uselessness ringing in my ears. And I knew, in that moment, that the last laugh had finally arrived. I had the power now. I had control of my life, my business, and my destiny. I wasn't just a spectator anymore. I was the main event. After my speech, the reactions were immediate. People were coming up to me, shaking my hand, congratulating me. But it was the looks on their faces that told me everything I needed to know. They were impressed. They were stunned. They didn't see this coming. And as I looked around, I could already imagine my family, sitting at home or wherever they were, hearing about my success, hearing about the deal I had just signed, and I knew they were regretting every word they'd ever said. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of far more than they had ever given me credit for. And when the news hit them, they'd know exactly what I had accomplished. They'd see that I wasn't just the useless one anymore. I was a force to be reckoned with. As I walked off that stage, my heart was pounding and I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. I had done it. I had taken control of my life, and in doing so, I had rewritten my story. No longer would I be the quiet, overlooked member of the family. I was a woman who had earned her place, not through approval or validation from anyone else, but through my own hard work and determination. And that was a feeling no one could take away from me. They had called me useless, but in the end, it was they who had underestimated me. And now, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The days following the conference were a whirlwind. My phone was buzzing nonstop with messages from colleagues, clients, and friends. The news of my business deal spread like wildfire through the industry. Everyone was talking about it, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride every time I read a congratulatory message or a piece of praise. But amidst the excitement, there was one thing that lingered in the back of my mind: the thought of my family. I hadn't spoken to any of them since the wedding, and I had a feeling that they were already talking. Gossip travels fast in families like mine. They couldn't possibly have missed the announcement. The moment I got back to my apartment after the conference, I decided to check my messages. Sure enough, there were a few unread texts from my mother, my sisters, and a couple of cousins. Most of them were congratulatory in tone, but there was an edge to them, an almost palpable discomfort beneath the surface. It didn't take long for Natalie to reach out. She texted me the next morning, her words carefully chosen but laced with passive aggression. "Wow, Emma, I didn't realize you were doing so well. Maybe I misjudged you. I suppose we've all been too caught up in our own lives to notice, huh?" The words stung in a way I didn't expect. I had hoped for something more genuine, some acknowledgement that they had been wrong about me. But instead, it felt like she was trying to make herself look good, like she was offering a backhanded apology wrapped in a thin veil of faux compliments. But I didn't bite. I didn't need to respond right away. I was busy, too busy to entertain half-hearted apologies. The truth was, I didn't need their validation anymore. I had moved past needing them to tell me I was worthy. I had already proven that to myself. Then came the call from my mother. She was frantic, as always, trying to maintain the fragile peace that had always existed in our family. But this time, I wasn't so inclined to keep the peace. Emma, I've heard what you did. I saw your speech at the conference. I have to admit, I'm a little shocked, sweetheart. You've really gone above and beyond. But, sweetheart, do you think maybe you could have mentioned that you were doing well without making everyone else feel so, well, inferior? Her voice wavered, not from concern, but from the familiar tone of guilt tripping. I knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't upset about my success. She was upset about how it reflected on her family. She didn't want them to feel bad, and she certainly didn't want them to think they had failed to raise me properly. I didn't mean to make anyone feel inferior, I replied calmly. I just wanted to let people know I've been working hard, Mom, and I wanted to do it on my terms. I'm not going to hide what I've accomplished just to make anyone feel better about themselves. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the wheels turning in her head, and I knew she was trying to come up with some way to shift the blame back onto me. But for the first time, I wasn't having it. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into feeling guilty for standing up for myself. I had worked too hard for this moment to let her, or anyone, take it away from me. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, she said after a moment, but it didn't sound sincere. I just think, I just think you should be careful. People don't always take to that kind of success. I couldn't help but chuckle under my breath. I'm aware, Mom, but if they can't handle it, that's their problem, not mine. Another long pause. I could almost feel her on the other side of the phone, trying to figure out how to make me feel small again. But I wasn't having it. I wasn't going to let them turn my success into something I should apologize for. After a few more uncomfortable pleasantries, the conversation ended. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a small sense of relief. I had set a boundary. I had stood up for myself. And I knew deep down that my family would never see me the same way again. A few hours later, I received another text, this time from Megan, my other sister-in-law. She wasn't as subtle as Natalie, and her message was more direct, almost accusatory. So I guess you're too busy for us now, huh? Off doing your big business thing while the rest of us are stuck at home with kids and responsibilities. It must be nice to just get to do whatever you want, huh? There it was, the judgment. The same judgment I had faced for years. The belief that because I didn't fit into their mold of success, because I didn't have a husband and kids, I was somehow less. But this time, I wasn't going to let her words break me. I took a deep breath, stared at the message for a moment, and then instead of replying immediately, I put my phone down. I didn't owe her an explanation. I didn't need to justify my life choices to anyone anymore. I had spent years letting their words sink in, believing that I wasn't enough because I wasn't like them. But now, I knew better. I was enough, more than enough. And if they couldn't see that, it wasn't my problem. That night, after I had set the phone aside, I reflected on everything that had happened. I thought about the years of being overlooked, the years of being called useless, and the years of wondering if I was doing something wrong by not conforming to their expectations. But in the silence of my apartment, I realized something important. I wasn't the one who needed to change. It was them. They needed to understand that success and fulfillment weren't defined by marriage, kids, or a picture-perfect life. And in that realization, I found peace. They didn't get to decide my worth anymore. I did. But as much as I wanted to move on, I knew that this wasn't the end of it. My family wasn't going to just let it go. They weren't going to forget the humiliation they felt, and sooner or later, they'd come knocking. But I was ready for them now. The power had shifted, and this time, I would control the narrative. The last laugh was mine. It was only a few days after the texts and the awkward phone call with my mom that I realized my family wasn't going to let it go. I should have expected it, really. Family dynamics are like a storm. Once you stir the air, it takes a while before it settles, and usually it doesn't settle without a lot of noise first. Sure enough, Natalie called me one evening, her tone forced, as if she were trying to keep things cordial, but I could tell she was angry. The cracks in her calm facade were already showing. Emma, can we talk? Her voice sounded tight, clipped. I don't want to fight, but this whole thing, it's been hard on everyone. You know how they are. They're just upset. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I'd been waiting for this moment, And now that it was here, I felt oddly calm. The old Emma, the one who would have caved to family pressure, was long gone. Hard on everyone? Really, Natalie, it's not hard for me. In fact, it's been freeing. She paused. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, her next words carefully measured. What I mean is, you've caused a lot of tension. You've always kept to yourself, and we've accepted that. But now it feels like you're rubbing it in our faces. This whole look at me, I've made it thing, don't you think it's a little much? I almost laughed. Rubbing it in your faces? What are you talking about? I did a presentation at a business conference. I announced a deal I've worked for months to finalize. How is that rubbing anything in anyone's face? I wasn't looking for approval from you or anyone else. But if you can't handle it, maybe that's something you should work on, not me. Her silence hung heavy in the air. She wasn't used to being confronted like this, and it made her uncomfortable. I knew she expected me to apologize, to back down, to make it easier for them to keep pretending everything was okay. But I wasn't about to do that. I wasn't going to let their discomfort dictate how I lived my life anymore. You've always been difficult, Emma, she finally said, her voice dripping with frustration. Why does everything have to be a statement with you? Why can't you just live a quiet life like the rest of us? Because that's never been my life, I said flatly, my voice steady. And you're right, I don't want to live like the rest of you. I want to build something of my own, without constantly being told I'm not enough. You're upset because I'm no longer the quiet, invisible person you could easily control. That's not my problem. I'm not going to shrink back to make you feel more comfortable. There was a long pause, and then she sighed dramatically. Fine, Emma. If that's how you feel, then we don't need to talk about this anymore. But don't expect us to just forget what you did. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to accept that I'm not the person you want me to be, and I'm okay with that. You should be too. The call ended shortly after that, and for a brief moment I felt an odd sense of calm. The tension that had been building inside me for so long was finally being released. I wasn't a prisoner to their expectations anymore. I wasn't the quiet one who sat back and let them dictate the terms. I was free to live my life on my terms. The next morning, I received a text from my mother. It was clear she had spoken to Natalie, and now she was ready to add her voice to the chorus of discontent. I've been thinking about everything, Emma. I understand that you're doing well for yourself, but don't you think you're alienating everyone? This whole thing, it's too much for us to process. Maybe you could take a step back, just for a little while, for the sake of family? I read the message and felt a flicker of anger rising in me again. There it was, the manipulation, the guilt tripping. The same pattern I'd seen time and time again. The underlying message was clear. Tone it down. Don't make us feel bad about our lives by succeeding too much. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I took a deep breath and thought about it. I realized then that I couldn't continue to play their game. I had been doing it for so long, shrinking myself to fit their narrative, suppressing my achievements because they weren't ready to accept me for who I was. But that was over. I wasn't going to apologize for my success. I wasn't going to dim my light to make them feel better. That evening, after work, I called a family meeting. It wasn't a formal invitation. It wasn't even necessary to make it official. I simply texted everyone, telling them to meet me at my place that Saturday. I knew they wouldn't like it, but I didn't care. They needed to hear the truth, and I was going to make sure they did. Saturday came, and when they arrived, the tension was already thick in the air. My mother, my father, my two sisters-in-law, and their husbands all sat in the living room, awkwardly shifting in their seats, waiting for me to speak. I started slowly, my voice calm but firm. I invited you all here because there's something I need to say, something that's been building for a while. You all know that I've been doing well in my career. You know about the deal I just signed, but what you don't know is how hard it's been for me to get here. You've spent years telling me what I should do, how I should live, how I should look, who I should be, and for a long time I listened. I played the role you set for me because I thought I had to, but not anymore. I paused, letting the words sink in. You've called me useless. You've made me feel like I'm not enough because I haven't followed your path. But the truth is, I've been building my life the way I want it. I've worked harder than any of you know, and I'm proud of what I've achieved. I'm done apologizing for it, and I'm done letting you make me feel like I'm not worthy of my own success. I could see the shock in their faces. My mom looked like she was going to say something, but I held up my hand, signaling that this wasn't a conversation where I was going to back down. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you that this is my life and I'm living it on my terms. If you don't like that, I can't help you. But I'm not going to let you push me back into that small box where I'm nothing more than the quiet, useless member of the family anymore. That's over. The silence in the room was deafening. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was like they were waiting for me to cave, waiting for me to backpedal. But I didn't. And when I saw their faces, some of them stunned, some of them angry, some of them regretful, I knew that I had finally taken control of my own narrative. The words had been said, and they couldn't be unsaid. I had made my stand. Now it was their turn to deal with it. Finally, my father, who had been quiet up until that point, spoke. You've always been strong-willed, Emma, but I think we all need to come to terms with the fact that you're not the same person we thought you were. And maybe, just maybe, that's okay. His words weren't a full endorsement, but they were a start. And that was enough for me. The family meeting ended soon after, and as I watched them leave one by one, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I hadn't just stood up for myself, I had taken back my power. The last laugh wasn't about mocking anyone or getting revenge. It was about owning my success and making them see that I wasn't going to be the quiet one anymore. The storm had passed, and I was standing tall, unapologetically me. A few weeks passed after the family meeting, and as much as I had anticipated pushback or more guilt-tripping from them, I was met with a strange kind of silence. It wasn't the peace I had hoped for, it was more like an uneasy truce. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with my own guilt or worry. The changes I had made to my life were still sinking in, not just for me, but for my family. I continued to work hard, building on the success I had started to claim for myself. The deals kept rolling in, and my business was growing steadily. But more importantly, I was finally living for me, not for anyone else's approval. My mom called me a few times after the family meeting, but each conversation was different. She would ask how things were going, make small talk about the weather, or mention something about a neighbor's new baby. There was no mention of the useless comment or the conference speech anymore. She didn't bring up my success either. It was as if she was waiting for me to apologize for breaking free, but she never quite got the courage to ask me to revert back. I think deep down, she knew that this was a shift that couldn't be undone. I never received a direct apology from Natalie or Megan, though I did hear through the grapevine that they were quietly trying to mend fences. But it didn't matter to me. I had done the hardest part, standing up for myself and proving that I wasn't going to live my life based on their expectations. Months later, I got a letter in the mail from Megan. It was short, handwritten, no excuses, just a straightforward acknowledgement. She admitted that she had judged me too harshly and apologized for the comments she'd made. It wasn't the apology I had expected, but it was the one I needed. I read it, folded it up, and put it in a drawer. I didn't need to hold on to it. I didn't need to respond to it. I had already forgiven her, not because I had to, but because I had moved on. The closure wasn't in their words, it was in the way I had reshaped my life. Jared and I took a trip to New Mexico a few months later, something simple, just the two of us. We hiked, explored the desert, and enjoyed the peace of being away from the noise. As I sat there on a quiet evening watching the sunset paint the sky, I realized how far I had come. The cabin in Breckenridge was still there, still mine, but it wasn't something I thought about often. The memories of the family drama, the insults, and the tension had faded into the background. I had reclaimed that space in more ways than one. It was no longer a reminder of betrayal, it was now just a peaceful place to escape when I needed it. I wasn't the person I was before. I was no longer the invisible, quiet sister-in-law who silently endured being put down. I had built something solid, not just in business, but in myself. And the most important thing I had learned was that my worth didn't depend on how they saw me. It never had. When I think about the wedding, the insults, and all the years of living up to someone else's expectations, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel freedom, the freedom to be me, unapologetically. The freedom to stand tall, knowing I'm not useless at all. I'm exactly who I need to be, and no one can take that away from me. In the end, I didn't need to get revenge. I didn't need to prove anything to them. All I needed was to prove it to myself. And that was the biggest victory of all.